Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Lindsay Hamill, Manager of School and Volunteer Docent Programs. If you've never visited UCR ARTS before, we're the California Museum of Photography and the Culver Center of the Arts in downtown Riverside, California. We're closed right now, but we look forward to welcoming everyone back when we can reopen. We're so glad you could join us for Third Thursday Talks, which is a monthly program where we feature artists, curators, performers, writers, musicians, and more. Today, UCR ARTS Senior Curator Douglas McCulloh will talk with Curator Sarah Bay Gachot about the exhibition she curated called Lift Your Head, Bruce Davidson and the Evolution of Seeing. The exhibition features works by Davidson in the permanent collection of the California Museum of Photography and explores historic context and viewer response as key factors in the evolution of meaning in photographs. As a part of the exhibition, we're pleased to present the digital world premiere of a Bruce Davidson film tonight called Isaac Singer's Nightmare and Mrs. Hookah's Beard, which was written and directed by Davidson in 1972. We'll play the film after the program, so you can stay on for that, but you'll also receive an email and with a link to the film and the password, and we'll also post that in the chat, so you can access it on your own if you'd like. So before the program starts, we at UCR ARTS would like to first respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air. The Cahuilla, Gabrielina, Tongva, Luceño, and Serrano people, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, staff, and students. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on these homelands. We're so glad you could join us today, and we'll have time for you to ask questions toward the end of the hour. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to our speaker. Sarah Bay Gachot is an independent curator and writer. Lift Your Head, Bruce Davidson, and the Evolution of Seeing is her second exhibition with the museum. Her first show, Robert Cumming, The Secret Life of Objects, opened at the California Museum of Photography in 2018. She received her master's degree in art history from the University of California, Riverside, with a focus on photography and writing. Since then, her book, Robert Cumming, The Difficulties of Nonsense, was published by Aperture in 2016, and she has taught the history of photography, been a research fellow at Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and for many years, an independent exhibition and event curator. Her writing has appeared in Aperture Magazine, Hyperallergic, The Photo iBlog, The Photo Book Review, among other publications, as well as several artist books and catalogs. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you so much for introducing. And hi, Doug.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Here.
So I'm excited to just kind of have a chat about the show. I also want to touch upon some other stuff about the museum and the permanent collection and what it's been like in the last couple of months working in museums. So, but first, I think talking about a little bit about how this is a show of works from the collection of the California Museum of Photography by Bruce Davidson. These were all images. These are all works that came to the museum in one large group a couple of years ago, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Bruce Davidson, I mean, it's really a great donation for the museum because he's been around as a luminary of documentary photography, late 20th century, and still going. And he is born in Chicago, outside of Chicago, was studying photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology and Yale, and he was actually stationed in Paris and met Henri Cartier-Bresson, and that's kind of what led him to Magnum Agency, which was the renowned photo agency. He was also doing a lot of work for Life magazine, and had kind of gotten. He wanted to do something a little bit more substantial, I think. And so working for Magnum allowed him to do these more long-term, in-depth assignments and photo essays and photo stories and series. And that's kind of, I think, how he really got into the bulk of the work that's in the show. Lift Your Head is mostly comprised of a series called Brooklyn Gang, Time of Change, which was all the work that Bruce Davidson shot in the civil rights era, and a project he did in Harlem called East 100th Street, and then also a bunch of photos that he took in the New York subway. So, so he's a really respected photographer, and one of the things that came up as I was thinking about this show when you guys invited me to come in and curate was why now? You know, what is it about Bruce Davidson that's important now? So, but first I want to talk about this permanent collection. What kind of, this is something that the third floor of the CMP is always permanent collection shows. And this just started happening a couple of years ago after the sort of renovation of the museum, which was exciting. And you've got the third floor and you've got the floor downstairs where you show works. But can you talk a little bit about, like, what is the collection? What are some of the highlights? Is it growing? Where does this work come from?
Yeah, no, the California Museum of Photography is the photo museum of the University of California, and its 50th anniversary is coming up in a couple of years. So it's a major collection. When it started, it was the only West Coast museum dedicated to photography. The collection is about 500,000 objects. And one of the interesting things about it is that, of course, there are many photographs, but in addition, we have a charge of kind of cultural and technological histories as well. So there's a big collection of cameras and image making apparatus, like 20,000 plus of those. And so it's really double barreled. There are a bunch of major holdings. Some of them are the largest in the world of their type. The Keystone mast is extremely well known. It's stereoscopic photographs and negatives, more than 300,000 of them actually. They're huge holding in panoramic photographs and panoramic photo making devices. But then there's a lot of contemporary photography as well, portfolios of people like Bruce Davidson or Louis Baltz, Joe Deal, Linda Connor, Susan Meiselas, a lot of female, Ansel Adams, a giant holding, Larry Clark, and many others. So it's a major collection with a lot of deep holdings and deep strength.
Yeah, so
the third floor features work curated out of that collection.
Here's a picture of Bruce from Brooklyn Gang. I wanted to throw that in there, but I also these are sort of I'm going to sort of go through some pictures of the floor as you keep talking.
Yeah, so what's really great is the collection is growing. I'm on the Collections and Acquisitions Committee, and we meet very regularly to consider offers. At this point in time, with COVID, money is tight, university budgets are tight, and we're not running around buying things. Most museums aren't, but we're constantly offered things like this Davidson holding, which is just fantastic. So the collection keeps growing. It's a little bit like, kind of a black hole where once it has a certain gravity, then it just attracts, I have this camera collection, I have this collection of photographs, I want it to have a good home. And so it has its own gravity and pulls things in, which we're very thankful for. Davidson being one. So
such as these works, which I think there were about 370 in total, I think, in this collection. Anonymous donor.
What you didn't mention in listing the different projects is those are some of Davidson's major projects,
Oh yeah, yes, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, totally. One of the series that he worked on that is not included in the show, unfortunately. There were a few images, but I really wanted to focus on these other series. Was the work he did in Los Angeles, and I just thought it was funny that this is actually the first image that I remember ever seeing by Bruce Davidson. And at the time, in 1994, when I first saw this image, because it was the cover of the Beastie Boys' Ill Communication album, I didn't know that it was Bruce Davidson, but I'm just so happy that this has kind of led to here. Yeah, these are pictures of the show, and taken by our wonderful Nikolai, and it's looking amazing. Nobody is able to go visit this show right now because the museum is closed, and I don't think there's a planned open date, is there, Doug?
No, there isn't. I mean, we're at the mercy of all these closures across California, across the country for that matter.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there was a hope to open the museum and a plan, and then the COVID numbers started slipping. So everything was installed, this and a couple of other shows as well. And then it was closed. So it's up in isolation.
And your show is up.
Right. I curated a show downstairs on really West Coast wildfires.
Such weird timing. Yeah, and
pretty amazing.
Yeah. And that was open for a little while before.
Yeah, that was actually open for 3 weeks and then closed. So yeah.
Yeah, so people saw it, and there was a nice opening. But
there's also a virtual website, and the Facing Fire show is up on the virtual website, and this will be shortly, you know?
Yes, yeah, that's
visit the
true.
Virtual website.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about how everything happens right now in terms of museums. I mean, I know people have been talking about this for months now, but I don't think many people have talked about what it's like, kind of like remotely putting a show onto the walls. And in my case, I feel like it was funny because the way that I work putting shows together, it almost kind of was pretty handy for the way that this show is put together in a pandemic. I'm pretty precise about things and planning things out ahead of time. But I did get to come to the museum in January, and I went through the works, the 370 works of Bruce Davidson there.
I remember walking around downstairs in the study room, and you had just prints laid out across all these tables.
Yeah.
One of this photo here.
Yeah, and when I do that, I take pictures of everything. You know, I take my own pictures of pretty much, even though you guys supplied me with a bunch of JPEGs. I also just want to see like what they look like in my hands. They're right there, and I take a lot of pictures of the backs of images. Especially these were so interesting because a lot of these images in your collection were from the Magnum archives, and so there's all this crazy stuff on the background. And this is actually a part of the show too. We'd have a big blow up of one of the backs of these prints that kind of explains what everything is. And then, you know, you guys gave me a floor plan. I started thinking about how big the walls are and what fits on what wall, and how, you know, I'm all about the flow of a show and like how people walk through. You know, are they gonna walk? I don't know if can you guys see my arrow?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How they're gonna maybe like come over here and then, oops, let me go back. Sort of like swing around in a circle and then go around and swing around in a circle. So I kind of think about that stuff ahead of time. And it came down to thinking about fonts. You know, what is the wall text going to look like? And I chose a combination of, or just for inspiration, the museum was welcome to sort of design as they wanted. I wanted to have this kind of like combination of Magnum font plus these up here at the top, or these over here are from the movie The Red Shoes, which is my favorite film, and I just love the font from the beginning of the film. So I think there's, yeah, and then
if you get the feeling that Sarah's a bit you know, extreme fetishist and how far she digs in, but I think most curators are. The whole practice is a bit like going out into a huge open field and start digging, and you just keep digging and digging and digging, and you know, the more detail and you can think about, the better.
The most and most curators have years and years to be working on this stuff too, so they might, you know, be doing some of the stuff that I was doing over the course of months. I really it was nice being quarantined in May and June because this was the bulk of, you know, that's when I did the bulk of this work. This is all about, you know, picking out frames, sort of trying to imagine. I did all this in Photoshop, imagine different sizes of frames and colors and stuff. And then Subway was a real challenge because you guys have about, I don't know, a couple hundred, maybe 90, I can't remember now, but a lot of proof prints from the series that Bruce Davidson did, going down into the New York subways and just shooting. couple of color works, but then also just tons of these 5x7 black and white prints that he would use. He would print these out and then choose ones to print in color from those. And so I made these little thumbnails, and I was trying to arrange, you know, what looks good together. And because I had this image, this was also sort of my layout in Photoshop, and I had this image of making subway cars, these four subway cars, and then the end is kind of like the people getting out of the subway here with this kind of salon hang. And then I also took those Photoshop layouts and then sort of put them on pictures of the gallery that I'd taken when I was there, so that I could sort of picture what things would look like up on the wall. And it actually turned out pretty great. Timothy LeBlanc there at the museum did a fantastic job. And I mean, he really nailed it. It's great.
Yeah. If you're getting the impression this is fun to do, yeah, it's fun to do.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of like data entry feeling stuff about it, but I actually, very meditative and very good. These are some of the larger color works that were actually loaned to the show, but the museum has some too. So as I said, this kind of, when I started thinking about the show, I was really thinking about why doing this show now. And so Bruce Davidson is such a luminary of, as I said, of documentary photography. And he's actually, I know his studio said he's actually in several shows right now, all over the place. And I wanted to think also about what documentary photography is, and how the sort of evolution of how we've thought about documentary photographs and how people consume them, how people understand them. When Bruce was making images in the 1960s for the series Time of Change, which was all the civil rights work, there was a very different way of getting images out. And how does that affect how people see things and how people learn? It's really about, for images like Time of Change, I kind of, each section of the show sort of talks about a different kind of documentary. And I think with the civil rights work, I was thinking about how images inspire, and how images can inspire change, and basically take pictures of things that people once thought were normal and show that they're actually oppressive. This is great. We did an interview with Bruce a little while ago. And so we have several clips of him and me talking. And I think, let's see, yes, if we could do, switch over to the clip of Bruce Davidson talking about Time of Change. I just want to hear what he has to say about it. And then we'll talk a little bit more and show some works. Because this year has been what it has been, yeah, because 2020 has gone so many different places, and along the way, several times this year, I would see images that you took from the 1960s, from the civil rights era, especially images of people on the freedom rides and images from the Selma March. Especially there was an image of a man with "vote" written on his forehead. These are such iconic images. I wonder, you must have seen these too, showing up in the news and showing up in the media this year because of what was going on with protests.
What's important is I had received a Guggenheim Fellowship to continue my documentation of youth in America. But what happened was youth in America became the freedom rides. Someone said to me, why don't you go down south with the freedom riders, because it'll fit into your book, Youth in America. And that's what I did, and that hooked me. I didn't know what I was getting into. So suddenly I felt I was pretty afraid. The bus before that one was set on fire. You know, I met John Lewis. A lot of things happened within me as no longer youth, but youth in the civil rights movement that moved me and gave me an understanding and a sensitization. I go, oh my God, they're doing that, you know? So I'm the kind of person who has to be there. Every day I learn something new, you know? And I learned from John Lewis's protest marches. I understood what is the price you can pay if you're, you know, I mean, if you stayed in the Lorraine Motel in Alabama, and I checked out of my room after the march, and my room blew up. That's really said to me, you know, you can't take anything for granted here. Someone else had killed the 4 children later in the movement. Anyway, I have to be there. And then I have to learn what it is I'm looking at.
I'm glad that you were there, and I'm glad that your images were used to recruit so many people to join these causes. It was a really important way to get information out in that day, since we didn't have the internet and we didn't have any other way to get these images but through newspapers and television. And that was so important. A key word that he mentioned was the word sensitized, because he was from Oak Park, Illinois. He did move to New York City, but going down to the actual marches, riding with the Freedom Riders, being there was something that allowed him to take these photographs and then allowed him to distribute these photographs in the news. And it's so different today. People were introduced to organizations like CORE, which is the Congress on Racial Equality. They were, you know, there was no Instagram to sort of introduce you to someone like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis through their feeds. You know, people were down there making images and spreading them around and showing people what was happening. And that was very deliberate. There were no algorithms involved in getting these pictures to you. You know, you had to buy a paper, you had to turn on the news. So I think that's so interesting. This is the image that I was talking about that I've seen a lot this year in the news.
I know, I've seen this photo so many times this year. I mean, it's amazing that a 1965 photo still has that kind of traction and grip and, you know, kind of agency in the society.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good one for today. Dick Gregory here, he's a comedian and civil rights activist. And speaking of comedy, I wanted to just touch upon, there's this little gallery in the 3rd floor galleries where you guys always have, you focus on one artist. And
right. It's called Analogues is the series.
Yeah.
And so we shot around a few different possibilities and ended up, the idea is to show, you know, a smaller set or just sometimes just one photo in the space that is a counterpoint to the collection show. So it's contemporary work. And this is by Travon, who's a really interesting person from Compton. And he's LA based at this point, but he lived in New York for quite some time and was a writer for The Daily Show. And then he was co-head writer for Samantha Bee and Full Frontal. And he has this whole other career going on. His explanation of how he got into photography, he's always loved photography, was that in New York, there's such a great opportunity to shoot street photographs that he loves. It's really vibrant, it's really alive, there's lots of things going on. And he felt it was like a pressure relief valve from working on these intense shows, especially when Trump was elected and the shows became like hyper political. To escape, he'd go out and shoot photos. So then he moves back to LA, and this is one of the photos we're showing, is from this year, from June or July, I'm not sure. And they're the street demonstrations that erupted, you know, Black Lives Matter around the killing of George Floyd, among other things. And it's a really interesting kind of counterpoint and raises a bunch of issues in comparison to Bruce Davidson. I'm curious what you would have to say about this, Sarah, is that, you know, Travon is a Black man who grew up in Compton, and he's out with a political agenda shooting these street demonstrations. He's not, you know, Davidson called himself a white guy from the Midwest shooting photos at East Harlem. This is really different. And the attitude toward that, the sort of agency, like who has the you know, kind of standing to make these kind of photographs, that sense of things has changed. So
yeah, and this leads into the next series of images of East 100th Street, because you just mentioned that he was a white guy going into East Harlem and shooting. And, you know, in my research, I came across so many times when people, back then mostly, you know, reading reviews of this work from the 70s, from the late 60s, where people would say, oh, he's the first photographer to ever go to East Harlem and shoot. And that was so not true. I mean, James Vandersea, Helen Levitt, Roy DeCarava, and this was all just a very obvious oversight and sort of signified the racism of a museum system that still happens today. And so this, when in the text that accompanies these images in the show, I talk a little bit about some of the controversy that came up about these photographs in the 70s, when these works were exhibited at MoMA, New York's MoMA in 1970. And some people thought they were amazing. They were so intimate. And Bruce Davidson had, you know, he really did spend a lot of time getting to know the people who lived here. He was very careful about how he got in to shoot these photographs. He was always shooting with a 4x5 camera, so it never felt like he was just in there taking pictures of the ghetto and then, like, you know, doing some flashy article and then like nothing ever happened. These were images that were used by the Citizens Committee of the neighborhood to bring to, you know, government agencies and make change. However, when these were shown at MoMA, a lot of people, like, not a lot, because I mean, so many people were amazed by this work, but some people thought, you know, is this just a way for, you know, to sort of placate white conscience, you know, and it's so close to where these works were actually shot, but very few people who were in these images after it actually came to the museum and saw the show. A.D. Coleman did a review. In the show, there's a blow up of some reviews from the New York Times. And one of the things that A.D. Coleman said is that no matter how insightful a white photographer may be, and despite all precautions he may take, he remains white and therefore alien. So how has that changed over time? You know, and I think, I know just from talking to people who teach photography that it's an issue that comes up, especially with documentary. Who can go in and shoot what images where, you know? So
yeah, I mean, I think a number of things have changed around this sort of documentary photojournalistic approach. I mean, one of them is this issue of standing, like who gets to represent who.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's across everything. I mean, I have a really, really good friend, a novelist, who is, you know, white from Switzerland, but married into a big Black family. And she says, you know, her daughters are the color of a copper penny, you know. So
right.
It's, and some of her, especially early novels, revolved around that community. But retroactively, she starts catching flack around the edges for, you don't have Black skin, do you have the right to represent that community? And she's like, look at my daughters, you know. So I mean, it gets complicated. But the other thing is, like, the sense of what truth is, or what what's being represented in documentary photography has also changed. Our suspicion of, do photographs really of this type tell a truth, or is it just as easy to lie? And that's changed a lot, I think.
What was just outside the frame,
Yeah.
And I think with this next series with Brooklyn Gang, these images are from the 1950s, and they portray a gang in Park Slope, New York, 1959. Another case, an early case, earlier than East 100th Street, where Mr. Davidson went into a community and just got to know them over the course of months and months and months, and gained their trust. And I think these are, images that provoke a viewer to question truth, because they see the myth, and I'll let Bruce talk about it a little bit, and then we'll come back and look at some of the images. So I will stop sharing, and Lindsay, you can do the next video.
I love the technical handoffs here. It's pretty great.
Yeah, the photographs of Brooklyn Gang, they're so film-like. They seem to come out of a world of film. Back then, The Wild One, Rebel Without a Cause, even West Side Story was on Broadway. It's such a filmic thing that seemed to inspire Brooklyn Gang, but then Brooklyn Gang was its own set of images that were maybe more about the relationships between these gang members than this cinematic vision of rough and tumble fighting, having rumbles all the time. You made some very tender, very beautiful images of something that was at the time supposed to be really tough. So I love it's the series that opens the show. You walk into the gallery, and it's the first kind of images that you see as you walk through the show.
One thing that's interesting, is Emily, my wife, she made friends with the mothers of these boys, and so she learned what their life was like with children, basically. And like the leader's mother was an alcoholic. She had 7 children. Husband was ineffectual. And actually, she said to my wife that she used to run to the subway to get, before her husband got drunk. It's typical. But you don't realize that these kids have a life, and so the grocery list is interesting. She'd eat, what did she, was it one dish, oatmeal. They eat oatmeal 3 times a day. The idea there here is it's not just a picture that counts, but the whole thing. That's the truth of the lives there.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, so share my screen. So these images were bought by Esquire magazine and published in 1960, and they were probably, some of you might have seen this. They were published with an essay by Norman Mailer, who also went with Bruce a couple times and hung out with these young gang members. And Norman Mailer wrote this very, very lyrical essay about their lives. And it was all about kind of pushing against the kind of boredom and ennui of post-war United States society, and portraying these kids as being super tough and super, just like, bloody all the time and doing crazy stuff. And the reason I think, that these, over time, we look at images like these and you see that they're just very sort of tender images and sensitive. And they look like kids, they're not hitting each other over the heads with bottles. And so it kind of can break the myth over time. And plenty of people have written about these images and kind of, again, pushed against that idea of like extreme masculinity being what these images represent. If you don't mind, I'll move on to the next. Subway. Bruce has a little bit to say about this. These, I think, are kind of confirming truth, these images, because Bruce went down into a place where people are usually just looking at their feet and not looking at anything around them. To be able to see what's actually there is kind of like, wow, that's what's actually there. And he also has something to say about that. So we can start that interview now. We have a lot of images from the Subway series in the show. And the way that you're able to focus in on things that people are literally trying not to look at as they're riding the subway is really nice.
That's right. But I have to do it first. You know, I have to ride the subway until something clicks. And then I'm into it, you know. I've very much thought of the subway endeavor as a kind of my studio. I have a studio in because every day, every time I go in the subway, something different could happen, or something to me, or in my mind. So the subway was a great studio, great equalizer, great place for me. And I got to a point where I was like a werewolf, that when I'm going to the subway, it's because I hear this sound. It's driving me into the lower depths. Well, I can have a lot of fun with that. And it teaches us something about observation and understanding.
Yeah, he really, I've read pieces where he said he really he got very geared up to go down into the subway. He'd have, you know, all kinds of stuff on him, from I think like even like tear gas and like, or, you know, pepper spray or whatever, and like a knife, and like just, you know, it was rough. And 600 miles of subway lines, he covered pretty much all of it. Like I said, I'll say it again. These are actually 8x10s, but a lot of the images in the collection are these 5x7 proof prints. He just had, you know, probably hundreds of these, if not thousands, and then he would choose which ones he wanted to make into color. He at first was shooting black and white down in the subways, and at some point realized that the intensity was just calling out for color, because he hadn't really worked in color film before. And so he started making these big prints to just really get the intensity of the subway.
What's great in looking at it on the wall, which I have the privilege of doing, but looking at these, is the obsessive nature. He's talking about like a werewolf being drawn into the depths, and he just goes and goes and goes and shot so many of these images. It's kind of fantastic, really. The obsessive comes across.
Yeah, they're really fun.
Yeah.
And it's like a time in the past. There's a lot you don't see in the subway that's shown in these images now. So after shooting the East 100th Street project, Bruce got very interested in making motion picture films. And we have a little clip of him talking about a film called Isaac Singer's Nightmare and Mrs. Pupko's Beard, which we are showing. And I'm so excited about showing this film. This is something that came, sort of landed in our laps a couple of months ago, because I met a friend of Bruce's who has named Adam Beckman, who's a cinematographer, and he's an old family friend. He's been helping Bruce digitize his films. And these films were made for, a lot of them, two of them were given grants by the American Film Institute, including this one. But there was another one that was made for CBS called Zoo Doctor. And so these films have been shown maybe in exhibitions, but never online, and maybe on television a while back, but never online and never available like this. And so we are showing this film all weekend long, and it's really a great short film. But let's see what he has to say about it. Okay. You made 3 films. You made 3 films in the late 60s, I guess, early 70s, or just in the early 70s. One was Living Off the Land. One was Zoo Doctor.
Yeah.
And then Isaac Singer's Nightmare and Mrs. Pupka's Beard.
Right.
What brought you to making motion picture films as opposed to still images?
There was a reason for it. My photographs became very still. And on 100th Street one day, I took a movie camera and started to photograph people who I knew. So for instance, a young youth would comb their hair reflected in the lens of the movie camera. In other words, it didn't matter that there was a movie. They knew me. And I got a little tired of standing in one place to make a photograph. So that got me off. Anyway, you were talking about Isaac Singer, how that began. We live in a building that on the 5th floor, Isaac's apartment, Isaac Singer. So, and we lived above that, so my wife and I. And so one day I knocked on his door and I said, I'm a neighbor, I have to ask you a question. He said, come in. I said, is it possible to for me to make a film of you? He says, of course. I had this relationship with him. Every so often he'd take me to study and to tell me what he finds important. And at the same time, he did okay a film. So I was interested in film making, and he okayed my snooping around, taking pictures of him, even in bed having his breakfast, and his relationship with his wife. Anyway, I was interested in him and where he came from.
The Isaac Singer film is a very unique film, and the way that it combines documentary and fiction is wonderful.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody else do that.
I would love to know, what did you know about Isaac Singer before you met him?
I started reading several of his early books. The Slave was a beautiful book. Slave, The Magician of Lublin, In My Father's Court. These are all novels, but early and really good. And they would fit in to a documentary. So you have both the documentary and then you have the documentary around the feature film. And that's what I did with Perman. And Isaac took me aside and he said, one place I've got to take you to is the Garden Cafeteria. When I was a young writer, the Jewish Daily Forward was housed there. And I used to get jobs, I could work as an editor. So he took me down there. So I have pictures of Isaac Singer in the Garden Cafeteria. And the thing that was so wonderful about that is people starting to say, Isaac, it's Isaac, he's here. So I started to work out of the Garden Cafeteria. And by the way, I made the film first, and then I backed up and I made a film, a still photo of the Garden Cafeteria. See, I have Isaac's life and his cafeteria. And that's what makes that film interesting, is he's confronting his own life.
I love how you sort of talking about the short story, The Beard, in the Garden Cafeteria, but also really being in the Garden Cafeteria with the real people who were there, eating lunch, eating rice pudding, ordering
Yeah.
food.
Yeah, you're right.
It's really about, it's really a nice sort of a parable about writing as well. So it was a very, it talks about a writer. I know that Isaac Singer, I think he sort of conflated two stories from real life, two different people, and turned that into a short story. So it ended up being a nice, the fact that it's kind of true in the story and then it's kind of true in your film is a nice parallel.
I can tell you one anecdotal story. He lives in the building with her, and he has a pet parakeet, and he's a pigeon lover, you know. So I took him to the New York Public Library, where they have a lawn that can accept a lot of pigeons, and then we put food out for pigeon food, and he was walking through the sea of pigeons, taking kernels to feed the pigeons. And as he got more pigeons, he says, pigeons are super, they only move if someone else moves. And they can see someone else moving, they want to move. So what happened was when making movies, you have what they call clapboard. You go like that, and the cameras turn off, you know, or the scene evolved. And that's what I did. I clapped my hands, and the pigeons all lifted. And Isaac ran, and you have to laugh to see what he looks like running. He's running. He said, "You may know about movies, but you know nothing about pigeons."
Oh no!
In the film, you'll see him feeding pigeons, and he's serious about it. In fact, he went to Florida and asked if he could put his parakeet in their apartment for a couple of weeks. I said, sure. We had a back closet, kind of a small room. Every day I take the parakeet and put the camera next to him and run it. So the parakeet was absolutely very conditioned to hearing him buzz. It was safe. And but in the film, it calls for Mrs. Pupko to have a bird fly and leave. So we got the bird there, but the bird wouldn't fly. The bird landed on one of the actors' hat. They put a man dressed as a woman, and so there we were with a bird that wants to hear that camera and won't move until it does. And this is a very epic singer-ish story, you know.
Yeah, so I love the trained parakeet that wouldn't leave because it loved the camera so much. I think it's so interesting about the interesting thing about the film is how it really touches upon the sort of mysteries of life that Isaac Bashevis Singer captured in his writing, and that Davidson really appreciated deeply through this intimate approach to photography, where he wasn't ever trying to really beat anyone down with a didactic meaning. It was always like, let's see what's there. Let's see what these people want to be seen like.
I know his approach is really gentle and kind of exploratory,
Yeah.
curious, and doesn't
Yeah.
preach. Even makes a statement about my work tends not to preach, and that's true.
Yeah.
Davidson. Yeah.
I think, you know, if anything, I hope that people walk through this show and thinking about the evolution of documentary photography, they're thinking about what is outside the frame, you know, and never making that frame too tight, you know, and always realizing that there's someone taking that picture. I mean, this has been talked about for decades, but it's so important to remember that, and also where that image is coming from.
Yeah, there's a quote from David Levi-Strauss who says that, you know, the first question you should always ask is, who's using this photograph and for what purpose?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's always an agenda.
Sorry to pop in a little early. I wanted to be sure we had time for questions if you're ready.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
So Rita Souther asked, is there a body of work by Davidson that you would have liked to have included in the show that you didn't get to?
Definitely. Hi, Rita. Rita helped so much on this show. She and I are like born and yet two peas in a pod. The cafeteria series that he mentions and that he just mentioned in that clip. As he said, after shooting Isaac Singer, during shooting Isaac Singer, he shot in the garden cafeteria, which is no longer in the Lower East Side, but it was a hangout in the Lower East Side. It was very close to the Jewish Daily Forward, which he mentioned, where Isaac Bashevis Singer was writing all the time, and he'd go hand in his copy, and then he'd go hang out in the garden cafeteria. And there's just some amazing images. And the museum has a few. I felt like there was a lot more. There was so much more there that could have been shown, and just for interest of space, we didn't get to do that. Thank you for the question.
I would just also throw in for people who haven't been Googling or don't know that Singer is, a Nobel Prize in literature. I mean, he's a very, very significant author. So 1978.
Yeah. And Bruce wanted to make a feature film of one of his books, Enemies, a Love Story. He was really working on it hard for several years. And just the complexities of Hollywood just made it too hard after a while. That's when he started shooting the subway images.
So our next question is from Danielle Peltikin. Can you talk a little about documentary photography as a genre in this age of social media? Is there an opportunity for more truth, less truth, perhaps more meaningful consumption, if that's a thing?
I think that's so complicated. Thank you, Danielle. Hi. What really gets me is how social media comes to us, and how it's reinforced. Everything that we see is reinforced from what we've already looked at. So it's basically like we're looking at history all the time, and we're never forging past into the future with something new. We're seeing images that are similar to what we saw, and they might be true, they might not be true, but that's something that I think is really problematic in terms of documentary today. I don't know, Doug, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that really has fundamentally changed since the 1960s when Davidson was starting to say civil rights, is that there's a sense, not only did people have an agenda, but that photographs, you always knew there was something outside the frame, as you say, or that moment didn't represent some larger moment and so on. I mean, that's been known since photography was invented. But I think there was a sense in the 60s and 70s that the sort of photojournalism or documentary work that somebody like Davidson was doing was really trying to portray something real. And that sense, I think, has eroded, and considerably at this point. We're all in our own echo chambers and so on, but also, I mean, for a while, it's eroded, but there's a nice Andy Grunberg, a critic, comment where he says that facts cling to photographs like dust, which I've always liked. Facts cling to photographs like dust. And so I said, well, it's eroding, but somehow the facts are still clinging to the photographs like dust. But now, in this moment where, the whole sense of truth is kind of wide open, what is that? And being attacked from all sides. And now I'm like, I don't know if the dust is clinging anymore. I mean, I don't know. That's my, those are some thoughts. So the basic, the basic currency of the truth in that kind of photojournalism isn't there anymore. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I trust news photographs from everywhere except certain outlets. Because I know that they have a code of ethics, and I think that is still going strong. And, in terms of social media being there to show people what's out there, whether it's based on what they've seen before or not, I wouldn't have it any other way. I think it's important. And the fact that people can search and find things and get to know, everything about the protests this past summer. That's important.
A related question, and kind of an extension, now we're asking each other questions here, but is how much power do these photographs, how much power do they have to incite change, to make change? Do they? I mean, that not only has the sense of lies, truth been eroded, but then it's like, how much traction should they get? And Davidson or Travon Free would say, they can change the world. But
I think you're talking about video now. I mean, the video is what changes the world. The video of George Floyd is what changes the world. And actually, I thought, I watched this. You did an interview with Travon Free, and I watched it last night, and I loved how he was just so intent on how photographs have changed the world. Like he said, photographs ended the Vietnam War. Like that's what did it. And so I think that's maybe now it's video. Maybe now it's seeing it live, seeing it happen.
All right, more questions.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, which is good. So Susan Laxton said, thanks very much, Sarah and Doug. This has been fascinating. I wonder, Sarah, if you could talk a little more about the evolution of seeing. Are you talking about Davidson's own change in the way he saw the world, or in changes in the ways documentary was received? Either way, did you structure the exhibition to reflect that evolution?
Definitely about how the general seeing, not really Davidson's. I think he was always and he had a huge amount of integrity in terms of what he was doing and what he was doing out there, and his approach, and just this like really intent on just being open to what was there, and but in terms of what's happened over the past several decades, I think that's what I was looking at. And so to take each section of the show and kind of treat it as like, well, this is what documentary myth used to look like, and this is what a controversial documentary topic looks like, and this is what a documentary topic that really inspires change looks like. And has that changed over time? Were people so super romanced by the Brooklyn Gang images when they came out in Esquire? Yes, they were. It fit right into Rebel Without a Cause, and it fit right into those movies. But over time, it sort of that myth eroded, and people started looking at it more for kind of like the sort of swirling story, and seeing just kids, and the images of East 100th Street were at one time, for a moment, super controversial. But then I think people realized that this was a project that was very helpful for the community, and there was no ulterior motive. So yeah, it's more about the viewers, and it's really asking the viewer to enter the show and look at these things on the wall, and let it sort of ask questions first, become a contributor to the work itself, as a viewer.
Thank you.
As relaxed in.
And Michael Hawley asks if Bruce was able to take any photos of the protests this past summer.
I asked that question too. Hi, Michael. Yeah, he did. He was not. No, he had been photographing a little bit before the pandemic hit, and if I remember correctly, we talked about this, and then I think he basically saw it out the window, but was not picking up the camera. Yeah, unfortunately, that would have been great.
Yeah.
And then Tim LeBlanc asks, do you have a favorite image that you particularly think people should look for in the digital presentation or in person when that's an option? So once we get the virtual exhibition up.
That's a really hard question. I mean, I love the image of John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. You see John Lewis he's got a bandage on his head. It's sort of, I think it's the second Freedom Ride in 1961. It's the first assignment that Bruce Davidson had going down ride with them. And it just, I kind of got to know that image just before John Lewis passed away. And it really resonated with me.
You know, if I had to pick, I wouldn't pick a single, I would pick the subway images. And it's partly because it's so interesting to contrast them with other people who've shot on the subways, of whom there's a long list. The most famous probably being Walker Evans with a concealed camera and people caught completely unaware and blank, essentially. And they are so different than the sort of engagement that the Davidson images have. So the Davidson set of subway images, in contrast with the Walker Evans, is just kind of a marvel to me. There's the famous statement that the remarkable thing about cameras is that they take on the personality of whoever's holding them. And that's absolutely, I mean, these are so different, but the Davidson ones are marvelous.
Yeah, and you would make a point of asking people if you could take their pictures. And if they said no, he had actually carried around sort of like a gilt wedding album of previous work, and he would show them what he could do and say, you know, I'm not going to make you look bad, and then they'd agree. And often he would get their number too, and send them prints after the fact. So yeah, you can see that engagement. Thanks.
We've kind of already gone over our time for questions. I think there's just a couple more, but I will be able to save those. So Sarah can get back to you via email perhaps, or we'll find some way of connecting. I wanted to go ahead and before we show the film, Sarah, was there anything else you wanted to say before we kind of get that started about and I close out?
I'm just looking at I'm just double checking the questions, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, go ahead. If there's something else you want to answer, feel free.
Lucas says, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you, Lucas. In all our digital capacities nowadays, and helping us to look at things in these strange times, how did it feel to you to be so far away from the real prints at some point, the actual place? You mentioned sort of concept, not working on it, but not being there. How did it feel? It kept me sane. Working on this show in the bulk of May and June just really, like, it was my focus, and I was doing it every day, and it really helped. And especially because of everything that was going on with the protests, it felt like I had already started thinking about the evolution of documentary and everything, but this really kind of drove it home that it was important to talk about how people look at photographs when they are telling the truth. So thank you, Lucas. Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm glad you could get to another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and show the film in just a moment. Before we go, I'm gonna post in the chat the link. Yes, okay, so it's there now. The link to access the film yourself and the password. So you can, it might be a better quality if you access on your own, but if you just want to stay tuned here, we'll play it here as well. And also the link for our next Third Thursday talks, which is on December 17th. It's a program we're partnering with Inlandia Institute on to speak with Keijo Creatives, which is a production company that's working on a documentary called I2, which is a conversation with Black men in the Inland Empire about topics of masculinity, relationships, and identity. So that should be very interesting. So you can register for that. And also want to say thank you so much to everyone for being here. If you are able to donate, we do have a link there. And Third Thursday Talks are made possible with the generous support of the Marjorie and Glenn Thomas Memorial Fund. So we're very grateful for that. So without further ado, I will go ahead and play the film, and then that will just kind of close out the program. So say goodbye now.
I want to say thank you to Doug, and thank you so much, Doug. And thank you, Sheila, at the museum, and everybody who worked on the show when I wasn't able to be there, Rita and Timothy and Matt Klaus. And it was really fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
We hope to reopen so you can come see the show.
Yeah, exactly.